It's the week of June 18th, 2018, and you're listening to Missouri GrowingPoint Agronomy podcast. I'm your co-host, Pioneer Field Agronomist for Northwest Missouri, Jaime Farmer, and with me as always is my counterpart to the east, Nick Monnig. Nick, if you had to pick one word for 2018 growing season, what would it be?
Well, Jamie, it's going to be variability again, just like we talked about last week.
Yeah, that's right. The word variability continues to march on for the year. We're seeing some extremes out there. Many areas need moisture badly, while there are a few places that have been hammered by heavy winds and storms. We're going to continue to see some huge ranges in yield this fall if this trend continues for much longer. So, with that in mind, Nick, what are some of the top topics of the day?
Yeah, really, Jamie, the top three, I guess, for me today would be just thinking about the weather effects on corn yield, thinking a little bit about those disease, fungicide decisions starting to come up, and then really talking about soybean growth stages right now. So when I look at the weather effects on this corn crop, we're getting a lot of questions right now, which is how's this drought impacting the corn crop, or even in a few isolated places where we've had some pretty significant storms roll through. People want to know at this stage what that root lodging, what that hail, what kind of impact that has on yield, Jamie. So really, I think the root of both questions really gets to what is the current growth stage and what kind of impact can I have on yield right now. So right now, most of that corn is somewhere between V11, V12, and tasseling, starting to poke a few tassels out actually today. So that means that crop is currently determining that length of the ear, how long it's going to be, and then very, very quickly we're going to be reaching into pollination stage, that really critical stage. So if we think about drought right now, we think about its impact. Corn using about a quarter inch of water a day, it's quickly going to move into that 3/10 here at pollination. For those dry areas, we really have got nothing left in the tank. So we can see a reduction in ear length with drought stress right now. But if we get rain this week, really what 2016, I guess, has taught me, when we had corn that was rolled up like a cigar and it was starting to pollinate, shooting tassels out, we got rain that day and that saved that crop. So really, if we could get a rain this week, especially the middle part of the week, that really could save a lot of the yield loss, Jamie, and really only maybe talking 5-10% yield loss. But if that continues on, that drought continues on into pollination, then it will be extremely detrimental. What happens in a drought at pollination time frame is those silks are about 90-95% water, so they're made of a lot of water. The problem is that corn plant, the tassel will go ahead and shed pollen on time, but if that plant is drought stressed, the silks come out late. That can mess with the pollination sinking, you might say, between the anthers coming loose or the pollen coming loose and those silks. We can also reduce silk viability if it becomes too dry. So in essence, what I'm saying, if it drought persists all the way through pollination, the big problem is the silks either don't come out on time or they don't receive the pollen the way they should. So it's a major problem. All right, Jamie, on a little bit different note, talking about the weather effects, starting to talk a little bit about those storms and those isolated cases, what kind of impact do we have on yield there?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Nick. So for those folks who maybe got a little bit of the much-needed precipitation, unfortunately we also saw some storms with that brought some hail and some root lodging in places. The yield effects of hail are going to increase as we approach pollination and early grain fill. Hail that occurred last week would have had to have been dramatic to cause major yield loss. It either needed to shear the plant off completely, killing the growing point, or remove almost all of the leaves, as it would have taken roughly 80% leaf area loss last week to cause yield loss. So you think about the effects of root lodging, some of those heavy winds that we had there last week were likely not as dramatic on yield as we might think. Studies have shown that root lodging at that V10 to V12 only causes roughly a 3 to 4% yield loss. The bigger yield loss can happen at harvest. So that is why it's critical now to evaluate how well those plants stand back up and if you need to make special preparations for harvest. So row sensors and plans to harvest particular fields maybe first in that logistical order versus waiting on them. So not necessarily a major impact, but just some things to keep in mind where we had those heavy winds and those hail and those storm events there last week. One of the other things that we mentioned that's really right here on the cusp of starting to be a major impact or a major decision for us is disease and fungicide applications. So next big management decision for us in corn, for those in a drought, the disease is not a major concern at this moment. However, for those that have been getting some rains, under irrigation, it's time for us to evaluate that. So, if you look at the weather forecast, today's Monday, June 18th, Looks like we could get several chances of rain here this week. If we get the rain, obviously that yield potential is going to go up, but so does that disease potential too. So one of the things that we have been seeing in the field already is some gray leaf spot where we move into those lower leaves of a corn, particularly where we have been getting rain or have been under irrigation. No surprise that it's more progressed in the corn on corn ground. So that's one of those diseases that it looks like where we could be in a favorable environment for it to progress and something we need to keep an eye on.
Yeah, Jamie, I've really noticed that as well on my side where we get in the corn on corn ground where we've had a little moisture, that gray is a little more progressed on the lower leaves than where we see it in other places. One of the other ones, Jamie, and really probably a little bit more on your side, is seeing a little bacterial leaf streak out there as well. It's a new disease. There's really no data or studies that really tell us if it does cause yield loss, and if so, how much. But the other important thing to remember is it's a bacterial disease, so fungicide really has no effect on it. I guess the other thing I think about, Jamie, is, right now, some places it's really dry, disease development is really low. But if we do get some rain that blows in here during this week, and as we get later on in after pollination, we could see some other things flare up. Something like northern corn leaf blight, I think about, it's more of a cool weather, wet weather disease, but it can progress really, really quickly, resporulate in every 7 days. So it can tear a corn plant down in a hurry, even well after pollination. Another one just to be mindful of would be southern rust. If that moves in out of the south here after pollination, it can be extremely detrimental too. So I guess just the idea that we still need to keep our eyes peeled because there's lots of things that could come in. As we think about application timing on fungicides, a lot of times we'll talk about anywhere from that VT up through the blister stage where a lot of people will apply. I guess if it's me, if disease development's pretty low up front, you might think about holding that until the blister stage, just kind of the start maybe of brown silks, not deep brown silk, but just the start of it. It'll just delay your residual control a little bit further deep into the window, and it'll help you out in terms of things of southern rust, northern corn leaf blight. So something to think about there. The other thing, and really just the last couple of years have taught me, disease development, obviously the major driver for fungicide applications, but it really seems like there is a yield component there, and the higher the yield level, it tends to be the higher the payoff. With all disease being equal, the higher the payoff in terms of yield, Jamie.
Yeah, excellent point. So just keeping in mind here, obviously, like we mentioned earlier in the show here, we've got some fields that are just now starting to tassel. So we're right here at that critical decision-making time. So some good points there to keep in mind as we get to the situation where we start evaluating that decision. Soybeans, moving into that, the growth stage, even for early planting, we have some soybeans progressing along much earlier than what we would normally see on growth stages. We saw some flowers out as early as June 1st on some very early planted soybeans. Many fields are already at R2, which is full flower. We even have some really early planted fields that's starting to even set some pods. So keeping that in mind with the kind of the faster than normal progression through growth stages in these soybeans, particularly those folks that have planted early, what are some of the things we need to think about?
Yeah, there's a lot of things, Jamie, in terms of management to think about that we typically do. If we do them on a calendar basis, we think about this month or this time. But with things progressing really early, that means we have to kind of change our mindset. Probably one of the biggest things right now would be herbicide application timings. So it's just important to remember that there are cutoff growth stages for many of the herbicides we apply. So the state has some dates in place in terms of cutoffs for Fexapan, for XtendiMax, for Ingenia. But it's also important to remember that plant also cuts us off by growth stage. So we can apply those products on Roundup Ready 2 Xtend soybeans up through the R1 stage, which means when we get to R2, which many fields are at right now, we're technically done. We can't apply it after R1. Liberty, really we're supposed to be up into pre-bloom or technically at R1. When we hit that, we're done. And so most of our fields are already there now. In the last one, glyphosate, if we're applying that, technically we can just go through R2, which would be full flower, which we are pushing towards the end of that. So really, there are a lot of growth stage cutoffs that were already passed for many of these herbicides, Jamie. And if I think about some other things that are coming into play, some folks think about fungicide decisions and those kind of things. They're generally thinking it by a calendar date, and this year that calendar date might be a whole lot earlier than it has been in the past.
Yeah, excellent point, Nick. So on that topic there with fungicides for soybeans at least, what would be the ideal timing there for a fungicide application on soybeans?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jamie. R3 is really the ideal timing for fungicide application in soybeans, and that's when we get to those pods being about a 1/4 inch long in the upper 4 nodes of that plant. So it generally comes a lot later than what it's going to come this year.
Excellent point, and something that Pioneer has done quite a bit of work in the past as far as evaluating what the impact is for a fungicide and insecticide on those soybeans, something that in my book I see where it pays pretty much all the time there. Whether it's the insecticide that's having the bigger factor or the fungicide, that kind of depends on the season. But obviously, if you're going to make that pass across the field, might as well go ahead and throw that insecticide in there. You tend to get a little additional yield bump there as far as getting some return back on that. So with that, we thank you for tuning in this week. Nick, if folks can't find us in the field, where can they find us?
They can find me on Twitter at Nick Monnig.
You can find me at the Jaime Farmer. You can also look for the additional podcast at podcast.pioneer.com. Also, reach out to your Pioneer sales professional to get signed up for any of those Walking Your Fields newsletters and other timely agronomic info delivered to your inbox. Thank you for your time and thank you for your business, and we look forward to speaking with you again.